And then if I go into presentation mode,
That's
so
perfect.
how does that look? Does that look good for you guys?
Perfect.
Cool,
Yeah.
excellent. So then I can see my notes as well that I've made. So I will share this slide deck with everybody. Dan will send it out within the minutes. So no need to sort of take screenshots and notes. It's all going to be available. And as we mentioned, that short video is going to go onto the LINS Southwest Pacific YouTube site. So IGIF, Hydro and Strategic Pathway 4, which is data. So the content that I've used to pull this overview and slide deck together was from two sets of documents. The recently published IGIF Hydro and also the UN GGIM IGIF, which is it's just geospatial for everything. It's not the domain specific to water, whereas the hydro one is the IGIF that is specific to hydro. So the reason I'm waffling on this page is because the interesting thing that I've found is if you read part 2 of the IGIF hydro prior to the 25th of July, the version that I read in order to prepare and refresh my slides for this update is quite significantly changed. So I'd done all of my updates ready for our meeting back in June. And then when I looked at IGIF Hydro again, it's changed a lot. So if you have read it previously, the draft version, please do, and you want to sort of know it in detail, please do make sure you look at that new recently published one. So I've put that actual hyperlink to that document in there. Also interestingly, the UN version, the one that's non-domain specific, that's still actually in draft. It's quite an old draft. It's March to July 2020. So the content that I've taken from there is still the draft version, and actually the subsequent what they've called consultation draft for Strategic Pathway 4 is listed actually as forthcoming on the website. So I will keep an eye on that and look out for notifications to see when that's likely to be updated. Pip, you might get to hear a little bit more about that in September. At the UNGGIM conference. Okay, so just to start to go into a little bit more detail. So within the UN version, they create this graphic here summarising the visions, mission, strategic drivers, etc. for every strategic pathway. And this is the strategic pathway we're looking at today, which is data here. So underneath each strategic pathway, the UN have used this puzzle style graphic with 4 boxes, and the 4 areas under strategic pathway data is data themes, custodianship, acquisition and management, data supply chains, and data curation and delivery. So what this strategic pathway is doing is establishing the framework and the custodianship guidelines for best practice collection and management of integrated geospatial information. So the objective of this is to enable the data custodians to be able to meet their data management, sharing and reuse obligations to government and the user community. So the 4 key elements and associated with the data coordination as per the puzzle piece is listed there, along with a little summary of what those are. I won't pause to read through those. I think what I just sort of summarize is these are really underpinned by principles that promote consistent data management, sharing and reuse so that custodians can meet those obligations, and that these principles are put into practice through strategic actions that deliver and help to strengthen that integration of geospatial information management. And the strategic pathway also provides tools such as matrices and example checklists that are provided within the appendice of the UN document to help countries with working through those concepts and processes to successfully implement each. And they also provide a useful illustration, which I've got on the next slide, to show how all of that is structured and fitted together. So I'm going to move on to that slide now. I've split these into two halves just so that it's easier for you guys to read on the screen, but apologies, it is a little bit pixelated. I did play around with this a little bit to try and get it better, so hopefully, although it's pixelated, you can still read that. So this is a common graphic that you'll see for each of the strategic pathways, showing, I'm moving my mouse pointer around on my screen, which you guys won't be able to see, will you? That show, oh okay, you can.
We can.
Cool, excellent. Which show the sort of data themes and the various guiding principles that are needed for those, and the custodianship, etc. So you can see, you know, those real key fundamental things that we all know are good principles for data management around metadata, standards, governance, security, provenance, conversations, all conversations that we've kind of been having already, literally just in this session. And then it starts to talk about the key actions that you should be undertaking. They've put these into an order, but actually interesting to see whether, you know, none of us are ever in an ideal world. So do these actually get undertaken within that order? I was thinking to myself, I'm sure kind of the Hydrographic Office in the UK, we've been doing a little bit of these at various different points in time, but either way, the UN have sort of listed those actions there in a nice order for everybody. And then the bottom half of this graphic, it is one graphic. If you look at the hyperlink, is then those tools help you with completing those actions. So things such as a data inventory questionnaire when you're doing your data audit, things such as data custodianship policy principles and what are your data governance roles, things like that you're going to want to have to be able to help you with those actions. And also as well, all of the 9 strategic pathways, they've all got interdependencies and interrelated with each other. So there's a summary there showing how those different ones link with each other. And within the IGIF Hydro document, there's also a useful diagram showing how standards, and I've forgotten the other one, is really important to do with how we model data. Okay, moving on. So again, this is another graphic that you'll notice is very common for within all of the strategic pathways. And but what I have noticed is the headings tend to be different. So I initially thought to myself, oh, this graph is one of these graphics again. And I did see that actually some of these headings are slightly different, but still I found this graphic really helpful to get that kind of summary of those actions, the guiding principles, all in one location, along with those interrelated actions. So if you wanted to sort of talk this through with any of your colleagues to try to explain things to people, I think this is a really helpful graphic to use. So now moving on to the IGIF Hydro. So interestingly, there's 10 sections within Strategic Pathway 4 in IGIF Hydro, and they don't correlate with the UNGGIM document. So I found that a little bit kind of slightly confusing. So when you do look at this, reason I'm mentioning this to you just to sort of help people with digesting it. When you look at it, don't just assume, oh, 4.5 is going to be data quality in the UN link, because it's not going to be. So just wanted to highlight like that, as well as also kind of, you know, it's a little useful sort of context. And so in summary, from what the IGIF Hydro is saying is from the Hydrographic Office side, we've also got to include the requirements to implement data to support those international conventions such as SOLAS, also those UNCLOS responsibilities that people have mentioned before, for the production of standard conformant hydrographic charts and data to support legislative and planning processes. So the IGIF Hydro looks at how water is approached domestically for both oceans, seas and inland waterways and watercourses. And then one of the sections starts to talk about the fundamental data themes. So it references the fundamental data themes from the UNGGIM website. I've popped a little graphic in there of those 14 themes, but it does say that themes will need to reflect the country's delineation of the responsibilities, its physical geography, its priorities, who its neighbours are, and lots of other factors. So these themes will naturally develop over time. So from that, what I inferred is here's 14 global fundamental geospatial themes, but actually think about it from within your country's context and what would be relevant. So the subsequent section after the fundamental data themes is called Other Fundamental Geospatial Data Themes, and that includes the hydro elements, and they're described within there. And the fundamental data themes section, but this fundamental data themes section articulates the nature of data in the hydro domain and some of its primary qualities. And it also talks about how the hydro domain is characterized by several phenomena, which you're all going to be very familiar with. So the fact that the hydro domain is four-dimensional because of the domain's dynamic nature and how we need to characterize it by movement of time. So that attribution of time is often of primary concern in the data, and that temporal measurement within the hydro domain is often the tides and flows, tides and currents being affected by the gravity, and the tidal depths having some degree of change. It also talks about the dynamic nature and the impermeability. It's chucking loads of words in there that I struggle to say. I've got to remember this is recorded. The impermeability, which makes it really technically challenging to measure, and that cost of acquisition compared to often in the terrestrial domains. I've noticed our new members have come from the terrestrial domain, so it'd be interesting to hear some of your thoughts on that, and how it's can be quite difficult to analyse that data via satellite imagery, which tends to push cost of acquisition up. So moving on to that other fundamental themes. So I won't read all of this here. I've highlighted some of the yellow areas. So what they've done here is describe, there's more text if you actually go on to the PDF under these ones. I've picked out the hydro specific or water. They then refer to it as water specific. So within those functional areas, it says it must contain adequately expressive to describe the water-based zones, as well as the numerous and complex domestic and terrestrial features. So the land parcels and properties, it says the connection between georegulation and cadastral management is significant, and within the hydro domain, the relationship between those functional areas should be close and clearly defined. Under the elevation and depths, it says this is where we've got the real unique challenges and really tests that interoperability of the domains related to water. And there's also some graphics there showing how you measure that water line between land and the coastal areas. Within the geology and the soil, that water specific element is the seabed, riverbeds, wetlands and coastal regions. And then, oops, click forwards. And then that land cover, land use must include the consideration of water in its modelling. Okay, please feel free to pop any hands up as you want to jump in. So it also talks about that custodianship and acquisition and management, and it's normally within the hydro domain, it's assigned to an organisation, department or an agency, and the hydro domain has some specific challenges similar to those seen in previous sections of the IGIF hydro. In terms of custodianship, recognising the authoritative nature of the custodian and the responsibility for interoperability of the data should be implicit in the role of the custodian. It says that there are specific aspects within data derived from the hydro domain in terms of legal liability that increases the responsibility of institutions, and these aspects may influence the use of, for example, digital signatures and secure communications channels to ensure that data integrity. Other examples of hydro data in scientific domain, there's often no legal liability and standards may not be as well established and the metadata may not be understood or completed rigorously. Okay, and a little bit, I've included a little bit more here around the cost of acquisition. So talking again about that high temporal change and the need within the water domain to ensure that resource decisions account for that high costs, and we look at benefits for multi-use data and trying to see whether that can be part of the consideration for justifying the cost. So all those things that we've got in the data value propositions, those different use cases, how can those be sort of linked up to the initial cost of acquisition? Okay, and then on to data quality. So it's a frequent topic within any data, to be honest, not even geospatial data, and obviously that particular interest in the water domain and particularly for that legal aspects. It also talks about the historic data of profound importance for scientific research, and it talks there about data quality being an essential component of metadata for all content, and extensive models devoted purely to the subject of data quality. And then on to interoperability section. If consideration is given to those fundamental data themes and water is represented in the model describing the structure of data within all the domains in the infrastructure, then interoperability can be developed as the infrastructure grows and matures. And it talks about how standards have a really important part to play in this. And the key to success is interoperability between water and the rest of the geospatial domain. And I know that we closely work with ISO 19115 standard for metadata, and that's one of the things that we use at the Hydrographic Office to sort of make sure that our data can be used in multiple purposes. Defence is always a great example for that for us, because you know hydrographic data could quite often be on different systems other than just an ECDIS system, and the S100 series is based on that ISO standard, so helping us to get that metadata correct. And then similarly on the models side of things, particularly where SOLAS charting is relatively simple, some of the models to describe these areas can be complex. So the establishment of IGIF must ensure that either the data exchange between institutions use identical technical content, or they work from a common data model. And I found this graphic was particularly useful. So this talks about how those different features are kind of described differently for different use cases and within the different domains. So here we've got a lighthouse, which for the hydro domain would be identified as a navigation beacon, whereas for the air domain would be considered to be a vertical obstruction. And for the lighthouse himself, they're seeing that as an observation point. So I thought that was a quite useful sort of a diagram showing some of the considerations that need to be made and how domains need to think about how the data is harmonized and modeled to cover those different geospatial areas for us to be able to sort of establish that our integrated geospatial information framework that this is setting out to achieve. Also talks a lot about vertical datums, and that's the sort of complexity for reconciling the land and sea data sets. And that's the end of my slide. I've not kept track of time. I don't know how long I've gone on for. So over to everyone for any questions, and also, as I mentioned, any additions, because I'm quite conscious I'm presenting to people who are considerably more expert than I am.
That was a great summary. Thank you. These having done a couple of these myself, between IGIF, IGIF-H, the World Bank's baseline questions, C17 from IHO, this space is hard to digest. So thank you for adding clarity.
Okay.
Yeah, I really appreciated that too, Helen. It's an awesome summary, and I think having these recordings will be a really fantastic resource for our community. So there's a lot of material to wade through if you choose to do it that way, and having a summary like that I think that's really powerful. I was just going to mention on the sort of data theme space for this in this marine area. I'm not sure if you guys are interested, but we've done some work within New Zealand to sort of piggybacking off what's happening internationally, but also using our stakeholders to make it meaningful for New Zealand, is to create some marine geospatial data themes that we're trying to ensure that brings more consistency to how we're describing different types of marine data. I'm not sure if that is of interest to this group and sort of piggybacking off this data space. If it's okay, I'll just quickly share my screen to sort of show you what I'm talking about. So this is available through our LINS website. We've got the Marine Geospatial Data Themes link here, and I can put this page into the chat. But essentially we've, and as I said, we've sort of piggybacked off some of the work that was done by the IHO MSDI working group, but we've come up with 8 marine geospatial themes, and within each of those themes there's a number of data types and different sorts of tags and keywords that are meaningful to our community, and you guys, this might not be in line with what you're doing. We're currently working on the Mātauranga Māori knowledge theme, so that's still a work in progress. But I'll pop a link into the chat, and if anyone's interested in looking at that, it might be a starting point if people are looking at creating this sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I'm seeing lots of nods and thumbs up, so that would be really helpful, and I think that's exactly the sort of thing that is useful for us to share within this working group. Thank you.